Hello. Hey. Let's see if this is gonna stick. Anniversaries are cool. I'm excited about the anniversary next week of the church. It'll come in time because yesterday, my wife Christine and I celebrated our 5th anniversary as a married couple. I say that simply to say we love marriages around here. Like we encourage families, and I love every good excuse to celebrate what God has been doing in people's lives and how God brings people together, and marriage is one of those ways. So that's great. But yesterday was fun for me, not solely because I got to spend a lot of time with my wife, but I also started to feel like I had real parent stories, maybe for the first time. So it's my anniversary. My wife and I have this nice romantic day, and then my 2-year-old son, almost 2-year-old son, starts throwing up. I'm like, yes, I finally have one of those good parent stories. Like, the child threw up and everything was, it wasn't that bad. He's feeling okay now, but Christine isn't here this morning because he's with David, and just in case he's contagious, we didn't want all of your children to start throwing up, so they're at home right now, but it was kind of in a weird way, a good feeling. Like, yes, I have those stories. Like, good. I hear all these other people who have them. Now I have one of my own. It's my anniversary and my son's. So, without going too much further into that, my name is Matthew Lunders. I'm the pastor here at Damascus Road. This year, what we've been looking at as our theme is to go, that God calls us to go. Movement is just such a natural, necessary part of life. If you think of the core of physical existence, if you get down to things like the electrons inside of an atom, those are going around like crazy. Even if you go further than that, if you think about quarks and the gluons that are inside of a proton, gluons, which sounds like they wouldn't move around much because they're gluey, actually are moving a whole lot. Even at the smallest level, they're just moving like crazy. Life is full of movement. In Discover magazine, a man named Robert Kunzig wrote that all is flux and crackling energy inside of a proton. It's like an unending lightning storm in a bottle less than 0.1 trillionth of an inch in diameter. There's just all of this going on. It's like some of the lightning storms we've had the last few weeks. Who has been excited about having some good lightning and thunder in the Netherlands? Yes, thank you. Some of you who grew up in places that had lightning and thunder and came here and thought, this place is weak, now are like, hey, they do got a little bit of power behind them. This is good. Bring it on. So, yeah, that's kind of what's going on inside of us a lot. We're made to move. God made us that way. But what does that mean spiritually? And that's what we've been looking at. Spiritually, as people who follow Jesus, we want to love as Jesus loved. We want to teach what Jesus taught. We want to obey like Jesus obeyed because Jesus was our example. And he seemed to be moving so often. Not that he didn't take times for rest. He certainly did, but he was someone that was moving and had a goal. And also, Jesus is not only our example, he's sort of like our commander. He tells us to go, and he says, I'm sending you out. So in the theme of go, we've looked at a lot of the things that he calls us to do, but today we're going to look slightly different at a time when he tells us not to go. He says, don't go in a certain instance. And we find that in Luke chapter 21. He says, watch out that you're not deceived, for there are many that will come in my name that will claim, I am the Messiah, and saying, the time has come. Do not go after them. So today we're looking at how we're not supposed to go after false messiahs, false saviors, things that would offer us salvation that isn't real. First off, there are, I think, 3 dangers that we sometimes have with this. The first one is that we connect this idea of a false savior only with the end times and the apocalypse. And so we think, well, we're not in the apocalypse right now, so I can ignore this. I don't have to worry about it. Jesus, in like the verse right afterward, is saying, these false messiahs will come, and the end is still not here yet. The end is still to come. So I believe that we actually should pay attention to it now, in this time period. The second danger is that we think false saviors are only people who are so obvious that stand up and say, I am Jesus reincarnate. And then they're easy to avoid because we're like, wow, you're crazy. Well, that was easy. Thanks for the warning, Jesus. And we don't take it as a serious warning because we think it's only people who say, I am Jesus reincarnate. That is so obvious. But I think there's a reason why we're given this warning. It's not always easy to avoid. And the third is to swing sort of the other direction, in that we think a false savior is going to be every teacher or preacher or leader or pastor that we don't 100% agree with theologically. And so we get into this pointing of, well, you don't agree with me on this point, and so you're a false gospel. And Jesus warns us about these sorts of things. He says, okay, make sure that you take the log out of your own eye before you're taking the speck out of the other guy's eye. Paul warns us against biting and devouring one another and chewing each other apart, tearing each other apart. So yes, we do need to be careful of false teachers, but at the same time, we can go overboard with it and try to find every reason to pick people apart, and that can be a danger. So as I talk about this today, I'm not going to focus on naming people. We're just looking at certain types. But I'm not going to say, well, this person who you may or may not like is obviously a false Christ. I'm avoiding that. And I'm not going to say that we'll go through all of the types, but here are just some of the popular types that we see biblically as false Christs. So let's start. Number one, false Messiah. Number one is the militant savior. I'm going to use animals because animals are safer to use. So if you know the story of Animal Farm, in short, there's a pig who ends up taking over the farm and is very militant and is very controlling. And he says that all animals, well, it's written on the side of a building, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. A militant savior is the kind that will offer power to people, will offer control and perhaps security, but they'll appeal to our fears. They'll try to make you afraid of a certain people group, and that's why they then say, I will save you from them. Sometimes that's the majority that's getting rid of a minority, saying this minority is causing all the problems. And so the militant savior will say, I'll get rid of them. Sometimes it's a minority that's standing up against what seems to be an oppressive majority, and we'll kick them out and we'll destroy them. This happened a lot in Jesus' time. People then were looking for a militant savior. The Jewish people were living under the control of the Romans. So they're this minority that wants to get rid of this oppressive majority. But at the same time, they had people that were minorities in their culture that they looked down upon, such as Samaritans or some others. And so they were sometimes the minority going against the majority or the majority against the minority. But in all of those, they were looking for a militant savior who would just control everything. And so often those will appeal to nationalism or appeal to racism, or they'll appeal to our fears, and then that will lead them towards war or something of that sort. In 2 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul, who's one of the early church leaders, just tells us, don't be fooled by what they say, because the day is going to come and the man of lawlessness is revealed. And when he talks about this man of lawlessness, or this one who's a false Christ, he keeps saying, the one who brings destruction. Over and over, there's talk about things that are destructing, and that he'll stand up against everything that calls itself God, and he'll say, I'm God and said, and that he'll even have powerful signs and miracles, that he'll look very powerful, but his goal is destruction. So the first one, beware of a militant savior that offers power by way of destruction. False Messiah number two, I would call the salesman savior. One that offers freedom, but appeals to our greed. In the most recent Muppet movies, there was a false Kermit. Now, Kermit is the leader of the Muppets, and there was a false Kermit who came in and started telling everyone, I can give you what you want. And they all said, wonderful, and they started following him because he would offer what they want. The Apostle Paul, again, he warned his protege, Timothy, about such people. In the book of 2 Timothy, in chapter 4 and in chapter 3, he says that a time will come when people won't want to listen to the truth. Instead, they'll just find people who will say what their itching ears want to hear. That will look for someone who's a salesman, who makes it look nice and flashy, who makes everything seem like I can get what I want. I can get the peace that I want, or the happiness that I want, or it can be the way I want it to be. He says that there'll be people who love only themselves, who love their money, people who are boastful, people who have no self-control, people who love pleasure rather than they love God. And with this one, it is something for us to ask ourselves. Do we love pleasure more than we love God? Do we put our pleasure first? Do we put our desires and the things that we just want to have in front of what God calls us to do and how God calls us to live? A singer-songwriter named Justin McRoberts, this was one of those, my brother really liked him, and my older brother I always thought was cool, so I started really liking him as a kid. And something that he said that sticks out to me was that do not let anybody, no matter who they are, sell you a Christianity that's about getting what you want out of life. Don't let anyone sell you a Christianity that's less than Jesus. Because those people, they want to make a killing on good things. They take positive things and they turn them into products and they sell them to people who have dependencies. That's the culture we live in, and we as the church are not immune to such behaviors. Don't let anyone sell you a Christianity that's less than Jesus, that's less than the joy of sacrifice, that adds up to just getting what you want out of life, because it's not true. So often, we're quick to buy into something that will offer us what we want, and that can be very dangerous. And we see that today often, that more and more, it feels like people will go around from church to try to find a pastor that says the thing that they want to hear, or they'll go online and they'll try to find the theologian that says the thing that they want to be told. They'll have a feeling, oh, well, I feel like this activity should be okay, so I'll find someone who says it's okay. See, he says it, so it's okay. And we shop around for a salesman savior. One of the other early church leaders, Peter, in 2 Peter 2, warned us and said, there will be false teachers among you. And some of the three things that he says, these are things to watch for. Often there'll be people who will offer you freedom in sex, freedom in money, and freedom from authority. He says these are people who will find those who are just getting out of that lifestyle, who are out of a very selfish lifestyle, a self-destructive lifestyle, and they'll find them and offer them a type of freedom that just sucks them back in again into using sex against the way that God created it to be used, or using money for themselves. He says these people will be really good at getting your money. Or people that will just stand up against authority and say, I don't need authority, and they promise freedom, but he says they themselves are slaves because you're a slave to whatever controls you. Even if that's your own desires, you can be a slave to your own desires. False Messiah number 3. This one is fairly similar. It's the comfort savior. This is a story taken from Aesop's fable where there's a grasshopper and an ant. The ant is working hard all summer, and the grasshopper says, we have plenty of food. What do you got to worry about? The ant says, I know that there's winter coming. And then eventually, winter shows up, and the grasshopper is hungry, and the ant has plenty of food. So often, these false messiahs will be like that grasshopper. They offer peace. They offer comfort. And they appeal to our laziness. Well, everything's okay right now. And we need to look forward and be those who stay awake, who stay alert. The Apostle Paul again warns. He says, concerning how and when all these things will happen, well, you know quite well that the day of the Lord's return will come unexpectedly. It'll be like a thief in the night. It says when everyone is saying, everything is peaceful, everything is secure, then it's going to hit them unexpectedly. So we need to stay alert. We need to be sober-minded. We need to be clear-headed. We need to be those who are watching and attentive. Don't get lulled into comfort. Another story that is also similar is the tortoise and the hare. It's the rabbit and the turtle. That the rabbit's really fast, so he starts his race fast, but then he falls asleep because he knows, I have plenty of time to beat him. But eventually he finds out that he let himself fall asleep, and then it's too late. And the turtle, who just continued to be faithful and steady, slow and steady, won the race. So don't fall for the comfort savior. The fourth one is this, false messiah number 4, who is the legalist savior. He offers righteousness, but appeals to our pride. This is taken from the story of Robin Hood, the animal version. And the wolf is portraying the sheriff of Nottingham, who says, I'm only taxing you because the king tells me to do it. And that's often how legalism works. That this intermediate leader will say, well, I'll sort of tax you with all of these rules and all of these regulations, and it should hurt a little bit because the guy upstairs is the one who's making you go through this pain. That's often how we treat it. And they'll offer a righteousness that comes from yourself instead of the one that comes from Jesus. It's a form of godliness, but it denies that power. It denies the power of the cross, of what Jesus did. The Apostle Paul, again, he warns us this in Galatians, and he tells the people, I'm so shocked that you're so quickly running after something that's not really good news. There are these people who just want to force you to follow their rules just so that you'll look good, just so that'll be pretty on the outside. And they only want you to be their disciples so that they can claim you as disciples. Look how many disciples I have that are all following my rules. But they don't want to really talk about Jesus and what he's done. And we're told, after starting this new life with the Spirit, if you are someone who has decided to follow Jesus and come to that realization that there was a moment you couldn't do it on your own, but that Jesus himself came as our example, but also came as our Savior, and that he took the penalty for us. He was the one that showed us the way out and gave us his Spirit. He gave us the power to follow God. He's the one that made it right. It didn't have to do with our own good works. It wasn't that God was impressed with how good we were. But God said, I love you, and I will make a way through Jesus. And if you've come to it, realize that and accept it, then why would you work so hard for a love that you already have? Why would you work so hard to prove something when you've already received it and don't have to prove it? And that's what often happens with this kind of character, with this kind of false Messiah. We're warned in Colossians. He says there are people that are trying to condemn you because of what you eat or drink or the day that you worship God on or how you follow this. He says those rules, they're only a shadow of what was real. So instead, Christ himself is the reality. Jesus, our Savior, he is. So don't let anyone condemn you by insisting on their own pious self-denial, just because of their own self-righteousness. Don't let them condemn you. Instead, follow out of love and not out of trying to build up your own righteousness. You have died with Christ and you've been set free, and so may you know the freedom that really comes from him. If we look around the world today, we see saviors of all 4 of these types. Sometimes that's a political savior, someone in politics who says, I can make everything better. Sometimes that's an economic savior. Sometimes that is a religious savior. But Jesus says, the kingdom is God's. And so we need to come to the real Savior, Jesus. And today, as we're going to celebrate communion, we look at Jesus' death on the cross, which is honestly a stumbling block to many people. It went, in his time, against what was common sense. Because they all thought, wisdom is to be strong. He said, my wisdom is my humility. They said, oh, well, if he's a powerful God, then he wouldn't die. And instead he said, I'll die and then I'll rise again. That's how I'll show my power. So instead of being a savior that encouraged fear, Jesus showed costly acts of love that pulled in outcasts. He wasn't like that false Messiah number 1. Instead of encouraging our greed, Jesus showed costly acts of love. And then he called us to do the same. And he put his Father first instead of his own desires. Jesus wasn't like that false Messiah number 2. And instead of encouraging our laziness, Jesus is the one who got up first. We're told that though he was in very nature God, didn't consider equality with God as something to be held on to, but instead emptied himself, making himself nothing, and being found as a human on earth. So you have, I'm equal with God, but I'll show up on earth. It's a beautiful place, but it's not that good. And he chose to live through that. He said, I will be the first one to be a servant. If you want to follow me, instead of following your own laziness and having everything that you could want, serve others. He wasn't like false Messiah number 3. And instead of encouraging our pride and our own righteousness, he showed us his love first. He showed us his humility and calls us to accept that humbly. So if you feel like you've been following a false savior, my encouragement is turn around and follow Jesus. And if you'd like to know more about what that means, if you said, oh, this is interesting, who is Jesus or how do I follow Jesus? I would love to have a conversation with you about that. And we can take that time afterward, after the whole service is done. I would love to get to chat with you, but a short thing just goes like this. Number 1, you say, okay, if Jesus is real, if God, you want to know me, I'm sorry for doing this on my own for so long. Please give me your help. Thank you for offering that. That comes with humility, that comes with gratitude. A sorry, a please, and a thank you. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Each week, we like to have someone share a story of what God has been doing in their life. And in a few weeks, there's going to be a group of us that are going out to Albania that will be sharing the love of God that we can with them, both through actions of serving them, but through also getting to speak to people and tell them this is the hope that we found in Jesus Christ. And so what I wanted was to give the opportunity to some of the people going on that trip to already have to stand in front of people and start talking now. We had someone who was going to be first in line to do that, but he's not here this morning. And he offered a second choice, who's staring at me and shaking her head no.